Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, well, welcome for another episode. I'm going to call it an episode of Chat with Green Aggies. We're excited to be here with you guys today. I am opening up today, so if you have not watched before, my name is Dr. Becky Bowling, and I'm going to start off talking a little bit about water quality management in turf. This is a pretty big topic, and so when I was putting it together, I kind of cherry pick some key things to focus on. So this is not going to be an all-inclusive program on this subject, but it'll kind of just shed some light on some different research that's kind of related to this topic that's either been done or is ongoing. And if you have additional questions about this subject or you want more information on it, just feel free to shoot me an email afterwards. So the reason why I wanted to talk about water quality management in turf is because I have noticed, and I think others involved in our turf program here at Texas A&M have noticed increasing concerns about how to address water quality issues that are either a function of just the natural properties of even potable water that's being used, or what we are seeing is an increase in the amount of reclaimed water that's being used or effluent that's being used to irrigate turfgrass areas. So this is happening primarily as a function of water shortages that are leading to a lot of restrictions around the use of potable water. And so we're seeing a lot of golf courses, parks, things like that are having to rely more and more on effluent and reclaimed water sources that may have questionable quality. And so while these water resources can serve as a great approach to help conserve water, particularly in our urban areas, they can present some management challenges. So I wanted to talk about a little bit of that today. One thing I wanted to start off with is if you're interested in more information on reclaimed water, this is something that's regulated by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or the TCEQ. And so they have some nice information on their website, kind of defining different types of reclaimed water. And they have some, nice explanations of how these different water sources can be used. And so you can visit their website to get more information on that if it's something that you're interested in. Now, we've kind of talked about this sort of generally in previous Chat with Green Aggie programs, but poor water quality can affect turfgrass systems in kind of two primary ways. And so the first is directly through physiological damage to the plant. As a function of those excess salts. What we'll see a lot of times is those salts will kind of overpower other ions that are important for maintaining turfgrass health and lead to issues in the plant cell that ultimately cause pretty significant damage to the plant. And the other thing that we will see is this kind of indirect effect of salts and poor water quality through prolonged exposure to fine textured soils. So a lot of our native soils have varying degrees of clay content, and when those soils are exposed to particularly water that's high in sodium for prolonged periods of time, they can lose their structure. And again, this is something that I've kind of talked about in previous programs where we want our soils to aggregate or to form kind of these clusters or clumps and maintain good structure, because this is what supports healthy rooting, and it also supports permeability and movement of water. And when we have these salts, they come in and they ultimately disperse the soil particles, they compromise that structure, and it makes it more difficult for water to move through the soil profile, and it makes it more difficult for plants to root effectively in those soils. So those are kind of two different things that we have to be concerned about. And so if we think about salt exposure and tolerance in general, a lot of times there are some numbers that we kind of use to define the degree of tolerance in plants or the potential risk associated with certain salinity levels. And so if you're looking at water quality analysis, usually they'll put things, there's some different units that they may use, but a lot of times you may see this decisiemens per meter. You can see up there at the top, there's kind of a little conversions. If you see some of these different units used instead, you kind of know how to navigate between those. But what you'll see here is, typically we consider, when we're talking about salts in the soil, if we have anything around 0.9 decisiemens per meter or above, plants that tend to be very sensitive to salts are going to have some inhibited growth or reductions in yield depending on your crop. 1.4 decisiemens per meter is when we'll start to see inhibition of growth for moderately sensitive plants. 2.5 moderately tolerant, and then those plants that don't exhibit signs of injury or stress until we have greater than 4 decisiemens per meter, we typically consider tolerant. These are kind of similar values that we may use when we're talking about irrigation water instead of salt. So you can kind of have these as a reference, but it kind of talks about how different water resources can be used with different crops. And of course, again, some of this is going to be further influenced by the type of soil. So for example, we'll talk about in a little bit some research that's being done on sand capping, and basically finding a way to incorporate a layer of sand above your fine textured soil to help flush salts from the root zone more actively and help minimize damage to plants. So, when we're thinking about how to kind of tackle this problem, and this picture here on the right is part of a salinity trial that was conducted in turfgrass systems. The turfgrass that you see on the left that's exhibiting more injury is Bermuda grass, a hybrid Bermuda grass variety, and the turfgrass that you see on the right is going to be seashore paspalum, which we'll talk about here in more detail. That's going to be our primary halophyte. And a halophyte is the term that we use to describe salt-tolerant plants. Halophyte itself is a word that can be broken down into hallow and phyte, loosely meaning salt-loving. So, when you know that you have a water quality issue and you're trying to think about a management plan for moving forward, and these are just some things to consider. And again, we won't talk about all of these in great detail today. But just kind of things for you to explore if this is an issue for you. So the first is to focus on selecting turfgrass species and cultivars that have improved salt tolerance. The second is to consider the use of soil amendments. So we talked a little bit about gypsum last week, which can help when you have sodium issues in your water and soil. You can also look at having a leaching fraction. This is where we water a certain percentage over our typical irrigation amount to help flush salts through the root zone and kind of keep them away from our plants. The only downside to this, of course, here in Texas is that this means that we are ultimately using more water, which is something that we tend to try to avoid here. A lot of times our goal is to really try to conserve water. Another thing that we'll talk about again is sand capping, and this is something that's being actively researched and actively studied, and I would say there's still a lot of questions around this before you go and grab a bucket of sand and run out to your landscape areas today, but we will kind of talk about some of that. And then of course you can also, depending on the scale of the operation or the scale of the area that you're managing, rainwater capture and the use of rainwater to supplement for lower quality water sources is always a nice option because rainwater quality tends to be better quality over some of these resources that we're talking about. So I decided for this presentation that I'm going to focus more on some of the research that's been done looking at salinity tolerance in some of our turf grasses, and then I'm going to finish with a little bit on some of the sand capping research. And so we're going to focus on two main species today. So as many of you know, here in the state of Texas, typically we are going to use warm season grasses for a lot of the state. If you're up in the Panhandle or if you're in some parts of far west Texas, you may use more cool season grasses, which are C3 plants. But for a lot of the state, we tend to really lean on our warm season or C4 grasses, which include grasses like Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, St. Augustine grass. And so of these, Bermuda grass and St. Augustine grass tend to be the most planted and most grown warm season grasses that we have here in the state. A lot of times we put Bermuda grasses in our full sun areas, and we put St. Augustine areas where we know we're going to have partial to moderate shade. Now, in general, a lot of our warm season grasses are going to be moderately tolerant to some degree of salt exposure. So they're not going to be, extremely sensitive plants the way that we may see in some of our ornamentals, but certainly we will see a pretty wide range of tolerance even within an individual species. And so Bermuda grass is one that we often think of as being pretty moderately salt tolerant. And this is one study that was performed. I've got the title there: Salinity Tolerance and Salt Gland Excretion Efficiency of Bermuda Grass Turf Cultivars. So, excretion, that's a fun word. One of the things that is often researched when we talk about salinity tolerance in turf is that there's different mechanisms for dealing with salts that we may see in grasses. And they may rely, more on some of these than others, or they may kind of run all of these equally. But in generally, we kind of put these into three categories. We've got excluders, which are plants that have an improved ability to avoid the uptake of salts from the soil. We have excretors, which basically have a mechanism for excreting, or you can think of it as almost like sweating salts from their tissue. And then we also have accumulators, which is when plants will kind of sequester salts in the vacuole and parts of the plant cell to minimize damage to the plant overall. And like I said, they may rely on multiple mechanisms for really dealing with these high salt situations. And so in this study, they actually looked at 35 different Bermuda grass turf cultivars. Now, this was done a little while ago. You can see there's a 2006. And so in a minute, I'll show you guys a different study that kind of looks at some of our newer cultivars. But, if you work a lot with turf, you probably recognize some of the names on here, not all of them. And this is a mix of seeded and vegetated Bermuda cultivars. So we've got some in here that we've got kind of a mix there, and you'll see they're ranked relative to their perceived salt tolerance in this study. And so if we kind of go to this first section here, I kind of highlighted a few that I think are probably more well known here in Texas, and several of these are actually going to be ultra dwarf Bermudas that we use for greens. But you do have Tip Sport on there, which is still relatively common as a selected option. And you also have Riviera, which was a very popular seeded option for a long time. They actually just discontinued that and have replaced it with a new one called Rio. And so these are considered, to be, at the upper end of this particular group that was evaluated. They exhibited, pretty great salt tolerance. But if you look at the range here, 40 to 26, I mean, if I compare Tip Sport to Tip Way, yeah, there's some difference there, but in general, they're pretty comparable to one another. And so, of course, Tip Way is going to be one of our most commonly planted hybrid Bermuda grasses. And so we see kind of a moderate degree of salt tolerance here. And then this is a study that was conducted at Oklahoma State University. That's where we've got a pretty big Bermuda grass breeding program there, and so a lot of their Bermuda grasses that they are producing are being evaluated in this study. So we've got some newer varieties, and here what they've done is they've actually gone through, taken all of the data and ranked these according to salinity tolerance and the number of times that each of these cultivars was in the top statistical group for its performance and response to salt exposure. So in this particular study, Tip Way actually exhibited, excellent salt tolerance compared to some of these newer cultivars. OKC 1302, I believe that may be now the Tahoma 31, but don't quote me on that. I'm going to have to double check that, but this is when it was still experimental. Celebration, we actually conducted some work at Texas A&M and also found that to be a pretty top performer for salt tolerance in our study as well. And this is actually a common selection of Bermuda grass with a little bit of improved shade tolerance. Latitude 36, a very popular selection. That's what we've got on all of the sports fields now at Texas A&M with a couple of exceptions. And then Northbridge, fairly new cold tolerant variety Bermuda. So kind of gives you a feel for how some of these newer varieties stack up. And in this particular study, they found that Tifway is actually the top performer. Then there was another study. This one was performed, I believe, at the University of Georgia. Yes. And this one evaluated, they compared different varieties of a grass called seashore paspalum. And maybe you've heard of it or maybe you haven't. It's something that we do have here in some regions of Texas, particularly through the coastal bend area. And we see some increased interest in planting this in other areas. And I talked about this a little bit in some of our previous talks as well. And what they found in this study, they compared 4 different Bermuda grasses to many different ecotypes of seashore paspalum, and found that while Bermuda is often considered quote unquote salt tolerant, that it's really exhibits more of a moderate salt tolerance. You know, they actually go so far as to say that it falls somewhere between a halophyte, or that salt-loving plant, and a glycophyte. And this indicates that most Bermuda grasses could probably be moderately well managed at lower salinity levels for long-term periods of time. And then this was their comparison of their different seashore paspalum ecotypes, and you've got a couple of your Bermudas down here towards the bottom. Some of these are available now. So Sea Isle, for example, is one that we can get now. It's a little hard to find seashore paspalum sod here in the state of Texas right now, but I think that's going to change. And you can now also purchase some seeded varieties of this. So one that's relatively new is called Pure Dynasty, and we have that planted at some experimental locations out in San Angelo, as well as down in the coastal bend area. So if you're not familiar with seashore paspalum, this is what it looks like. It's got a very kind of similar look and feel to it as Bermuda grass, but it's maybe a little bit waxier. It's not going to be particularly cold tolerant. It can sometimes be more susceptible to disease. But in general, the biggest strength of this particular species is that it is considered to be very salt tolerant. And that's what this particular study found, is that all of the seashore paspalums evaluated exhibited pretty significant salt tolerance, but there was, even within those, quite a range. So they found that tolerance ranged from about 18 decisiemens per meter to 41 decisiemens per meter. So that's a pretty big range. But in general, they would classify this as a halophyte. And so, you know, that's something that one of the biggest drawbacks of this particular species has been that it's not very cold tolerant. And that's one of the reasons that we're trying to trial it in some different areas and kind of see how it performs. And there are some ongoing breeding efforts with that to come out with new varieties, and most of that work is being done at the University of Georgia, although Ronnie Duncan, who also worked with this for a long time, actually lives here in Texas and is still involved with some of this as well. So last thing that I wanted to talk about today a little bit is sand capping. And so Texas A&M is actually lead PI on a couple of big USGA, U.S. Golf Association funded grants exploring different aspects of sand capping. And they're looking at it more specifically from a golf perspective, and you can read about it. I will share this link in the comments here in a little bit, and Mom can share it with the audience if you guys are interested. Basically the thinking behind this is that if we add a sand cap, particularly on top of fine textured soils that have been significantly affected by poor water quality, the way that we talked about at the beginning, if we add a sand cap to those, ranging anywhere from 2 to 8 inches in depth, and this is something that they're looking at, is what's the right depth for these sand caps to be effective. The thinking behind it is that you're able to more easily flush salts from the root zone, protect the structure of the soil, and you're going to be less susceptible to some of these issues that come from exposing fine textured soils to poor water quality over time. And so, but there's a lot of questions that come up, you know, about this. You know, one of the issues that they've had is, you know, depending on the depth or the, you know, you would be surprised by the range and variability in sand particles in terms of size and shape. No one particle is unique, right? And so, or no one particle is, every particle is unique. And so, basically there are a lot of questions about what is the right particle size distribution relative to depth for this to be an effective option that doesn't dry out too quickly, that isn't too soft. And so if you're a Texas A&M fan, you may recall shortly after Kyle Field was renovated that there were some issues at one point. And the SEC threatened to suspend play on Kyle Field because basically players were going out and immediately tearing up the field surface and injuring themselves. And this actually had to do with the particular particle size distribution of that sand relative to the depth that it was installed at, basically created a texture that was akin to running on beach sand for these players. So there's a lot of factors that go into this. This is something that you are interested in. There's a lot of testing that goes with it, and a lot of ongoing research to really look at how do we get the most out of managing these areas. Again, I'll share this link with you guys so you guys can see a little bit more about this study. If you're in the College Station area, you might do a little drive-by. This is some of the work that we have at the very front of the turfgrass facility on F&B Road. So it's a pretty neat little thing, and hopefully there will be some nice publications and some new information that come out of it in the next couple of years. Okay, that's what I have.
Well, thank you.
That was a lot.
Yeah, that was the right amount. Dr. Cavanaugh, are you ready?
Yeah, am I stuff or are you showing it?
Yeah, you're going to show it from your end.
Okay, hang on. Let me see. Screen 2, screen 3. Okay. Alrighty, y'all should be able to see the screen right now.
Yes.
Go, 8 minutes. All right. What? Can I go yet? All right. So one of the topics that came up on one of the surveys was asking about palm issues, palm disease issues. Well, I'm not going to touch. There's a number of things that can hurt palms here, but two of the most common things that have been talked about a lot in the last, I would say, 4, 5, 6 years, 6 years or so, is Fusarium wilt and phytoplasma diseases. This is the lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing. So let's break this down. I call this the tale of two palm issues, Fusarium and phytoplasma. This is what we call a binary session, because when we talk about Fusarium wilt, it's really a fungal issue caused by the fungus Fusarium. That's why it's called wilt. Now, but what you may not know is there are a number of species of Fusarium, and at least the one that causes Fusarium wilt on palms is Fusarium oxysporum. But then again, there are two subspecies that cause a wilt on palm trees, and that would be Fusarium oxysporum coroniensis and Fusarium oxysporum palmarum, abbreviated as FOC and FOP. So the more common one that we find in Texas, most of the time when we get Fusarium, it's gonna be FOC. That's Fusarium oxysporum coroniensis. Guess which palm this Fusarium attacks? If you figure out the subspecies name, it's primarily the Canary Island palms. But there are some other phoenix palms that are susceptible to this pathogen. There was one research article, I think in 2005, by Australians, noted that the FOC is limited to a few species of phoenix and Washingtonia palms. When you dig down to it, what we do know in the US is we see a number of date palms, so Phoenix coroniensis, Phoenix dactylifera, and sylvestris will get FOC. And then in terms of the Washingtonia, this is the Washingtonia filifera, which is the California fan palm that has been reported to get FOC. Now, the other Fusarium oxysporum, FOP, also we shorten it to call it Fusarium palmarum, is one that is of a bigger concern because symptom-wise and observation-wise, it is noted that it can kill the palm very quickly, about a month from the time symptoms first appear to the time that tree is dead as a doornail. Now, this Fusarium oxysporum palmarum, FOP, was first noted in 2004 and basically reported in a research paper in 2009 as a wilt pathogen on queen palms and Washingtonia robusta, Mexican fan palms, in Florida. That was where it was first found. That's where it's said to be pretty much widespread and is a landscape problem. The other place that this pathogen has been confirmed is here in Texas, when we picked it up in 2013 from the Houston area, specifically from plants that were at the Kemah Broadwalk. Since then, we have picked it up a couple of times. It does not appear to be very common in Texas. Either that or people are not reporting because the trees die quickly, and so you kind of attribute it to something else. So those are the two Fusarium oxysporums, Correniensis and palmarum. We do have both have been detected in Texas. The more common one that we find in Texas is FOC. The lesser common one is FOP. It is here. We don't pick it up or see it as much at the plant clinic. Let's move on and talk about phytoplasma diseases. This is also a tale of two organisms, two phytoplasma. And you might say, what is a phytoplasma? A phytoplasma in the least common denominator is a naked bacterium. And what I mean by that is a bacterium that has no cell walls. It's a blob. So the two palm phytoplasma disease that is of concern in the state of Texas is in this quarantine pathogens. One is lethal yellowing. That's the common name, lethal yellowing, and the other one is called lethal bronzing. Now let me explain something about lethal bronzing. Some of you may have heard the name Texas Phoenix palm decline, or you may have heard date palm lethal decline. Those two things is the same thing as lethal bronzing. Lethal bronzing is the latest common name that's used to describe this disease. The pathogens that cause lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing are related. You might call them siblings. They're very similar, yet there are documented differences. In fact, the way that we describe them scientifically, they are Phytoplasma 16SR4 subgroup A, which is the lethal yellowing pathogen, and 16SR4 subgroup D would be the lethal bronzing pathogen. So there are genetic differences between it. The symptoms, however, what they do cause is very similar, but it does vary between the different hosts. Now let's talk a little bit about hosts. Lethal yellowing. There has been at least 37 species documented as hosts. Some of the ones that you would find commonly in Texas include your Phoenix palm. So that would be the Canary Island, the date palm, the Sylvester, the Robelanes. Then you also get the Chinese fan palm, the Livistonia chinensis would be one that you might find around here. And those are documented hosts for lethal yellowing. Now, lethal yellowing, this disease is most commonly associated with the coconut palm, Cocos nucos. And one thing I want to make very clear, lethal yellowing has not been found, has never been detected in Texas. Now, it's on the books on the quarantines because this is a concern. Lethal yellowing is known to be present in Florida, and a couple of years ago, it was detected in landscape palms in Louisiana, specifically sable palms. And there were 2 other palms that was found with lethal yellowing in Louisiana. So that's a big concern. And we have been looking. So as far as we know, there's never been lethal yellowing detected in Texas. Now, lethal bronzing, and I remind you earlier, this is Texas Phoenix palm decline, or formerly known as date palm lethal decline. Lethal bronzing is a different story. Still has a wide host range, but the host range is a little bit smaller than what was described for lethal yellowing. It's found in at least 16 different species. Again, mostly the Phoenix palms, the queen palms, the sable palms are hosts for lethal bronzing. Where we had found lethal bronzing primarily is around the greater Houston area. So keep in mind is with lethal bronzing, there are several hot spots in the greater Houston area. So when you think about the loop is somewhere just outside the loop, and ever so often we'll pick it up here and there. So the question's always been, what is it? How do you deal with it? That sort of thing. Well, I'm going to show you some pictures, and we'll discuss a little bit on management. So I'm going to dial back a little bit and talk about Fusarium wilt. Fusarium wilt, I don't have good pictures of Coroniensis just because I've never taken them, but the symptoms that you would find on palms is very similar. Fusarium is a vascular wilt, so you tend to see streaking and what we call one-sided wilting and dead tissue. So this is a queen palm. If you notice on this pic image on the left, one side of that leaf is brown, the other is green. A close-up of that, which is on the right side, if you go up about 1/3 down from the top, you notice there looks like patches of off-white stuff. Really what that is patches of almost pinkish stuff. That is Fusarium right there. It just so happened that this was a moist day, and so you can get that fungus growing outside of that infected tissue. Now, a few other examples of Fusarium wilt type situations here. The image on the left, that's my foot on a fan palm. If you notice, it's only half of the patiole that is damaged, and you also notice on the leaf, half of that leaf is damaged. The image on the middle is one that was shared with me by Dr. Monica Elliott. She's retired now from Florida. You notice one side dead, one side not. The image on the right, this is the one that was the original tree that we caught in south of Houston, where we first detected Fusarium oxysporum palmarum. And if you look straight up in the middle at that leaf, you notice it's half gone, half still green. That's a very common symptom of Fusarium wilt. When you see those type of symptoms, you know it's some kind of Fusarium. It could be FOC or it could be FOP. The best way that we can tell you is which one you would suspect it to be. If your plant died in about, anywhere between 2 weeks to 6 weeks after you see symptoms first appear, it's probably FOP. All right. What can you do about it? Unfortunately, with Fusarium, not a heck of a lot of fungicides available. So at the time that you get this sort of damage, that tree is pretty much gone. Now, for a tree that is infected with FOC, you do have a little bit of time. I've heard reports that tree could limp along for a couple of years before dying over. It just looks ugly. FOP, on the other hand, will just outright kill it. So as a landscaper, make that decision. If it looks like that, it doesn't look good, maybe it's time to replace the plant. Main thing is, how does it spread? Now, one of the things that Fusarium does is it spreads by the spores, but one of the things that it can do too, it spreads, the spores can get on pruning equipment and so on. So what you want to do is make sure you do sanitize your equipment if you're doing those pruning and maintenance of those palm trees, especially in the Houston area. I'm going to switch over and talk a little bit about phytoplasma. Here are a couple of pictures. On the right is the only picture I have of lethal yellowing, and that was from Dr. Elliott from University of Florida. And what that is a coconut tree. And the point that I want to point out there is one clear thing about phytoplasma disease: that tree is a goner when the leaf, the spear leaf, is dead. And that's a real common symptom on a lot of phytoplasma disease. You might get your older leaves flopping down and dying, and then your spear leaf is just dead. And on some palms, which has a lot of leaves, you almost get like a crown, a donut halo effect. So that's one of the symptoms there. The image on the left was actually sent by a homeowner with a couple of Canary Island palms, which actually had lethal bronzing phytoplasma on it. I think I have another picture on the next one. And this were all taken around the Houston area. The image on the right was actually sent to me by a TDA inspector when he calls me up on the phone and said, "Hey, I'm looking at this, and I think it's what you showed us, which called date palm lethal decline, now known as lethal bronzing." I said, "Well, send me some pictures." And when I looked at it, I said, "Oh my gosh, where is this? I want to go take samples." And sure enough, we found a hot spot that had, I think, about 40 or 50 plants. Anyone that was symptomatic tested positive for phytoplasma subgroup D. The image on the left is a really nice picture of a couple of levels of severity there. So the larger tree pretty much is dead. The bottom one, you notice the older branches are brown, but then you got a lot of green. But if you look very carefully in the middle, if you can blow this up, that spear leaf is brown, dead. So that's always a kind of a good observation to tell you that that tree is a goner. Dead spear. That's what I want to point out with phytoplasma. So what it comes down to is there a way to deal with phytoplasma disease? At least in Texas, what we do know is we have lethal bronzing. Short answer is we don't have very good options. If it's caught early enough, where the spear leaf doesn't look super bad, people have gone in and done treatment with antibiotics. And this is with lethal yellowing, the same prescription is given. Because this is a naked bacterium of phytoplasma, it will react to antibiotics. However, there has been observations that noted that once you stop antibiotic treatments, within about 12 to 18 months, symptoms reappear. So that's a concern. Now, in terms of how does it spread, with lethal yellowing, which we do not have in Texas, it's been documented that there's a leafhopper called Hyplexis crudus that can carry that phytoplasma from tree to tree. It is suspected that this insect is also the vector for the lethal bronzing phytoplasma, but we don't have good, clear evidence of that yet. Part of the work that we're doing here is also looking at the insects surrounding the base of those plants to evaluate, do we find that Hyplexis crudus? And then secondly, can we find the phytoplasma in the Hyplexis crudus if we catch it close to trees that are infected and showing symptoms? So that's an ongoing type study going on. So these are the couple of things that I like you guys to know about palm and palm disease issues that you might run into. And by the way, I talk a lot about this, about the Houston area. Please note, phytoplasma type issues, lethal bronzing, as well as the Fusarium type issues, we are seeing a lot of that showing up too in the valley. So it is not just confined to the greater Houston area. All right. And let's see what else. So, oh yeah, plug. Don't forget, Chat with Green Aggies. Back to you, Dr. Gu.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ong. Okay, Yankee.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm gonna
Yes.
turn off my webcam because they're kind of slow and freeze my image weird. So this time I just
You sound
voice.
perfect this time.
Okay, that's
Perfect.
good. So I'm still in Texas, not out of the way. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the nematode a little bit today, and because this is time that we see some damage from these pathogens found in the Gulf Coast. So primarily this nematode in turfgrass is primarily target for Bermuda grass putting greens only. So the other residential turf or home runs, which is not very important. That doesn't mean that there's no nematode, but the damage was not significant enough to damage their quality of the turf. So this is a primary interest for high-end golf course, particularly sand-based putting greens. Becky a little bit covered the sand cap on turf grasses, which is very common practice on golf course. And the nematode is really love the sand, not clay. Next slide, please. So the nematode looks like this, and most of the plant parasitic nematodes are microscopic, which is good. Some nematodes are pretty living, are parasites to human or animal, which is a pretty big size. You can actually see it by without any microscope, and so it looks scary and gross. But it's most plant parasitic nematode. You can see it, and there is there could be parasitic, but many of the nematodes are just saprophytic in the soil. So any soil collected, you can find many different kind of nematode. They're perfectly unharmed. A small group of nematode, which are targeted to the plants, which is cause a problem. And on the tip of the mouse, there is a kind of pin-like structure they call stylet, which is a uniquely mouse part, showing in the plant parasitic nematode. So which is there using this stylet, poke it into the roots of the plants, and then make a wound and get the nutrition from. So if there's a lot of populations, a lot of numbers presence in the turf area, which will cause the problems on turf grasses. And as you see the previous slide, the symptom of the stressed turf is not very clear. Very similar to other drought stress or too much activity, traffic. No any lesion on the leaves, and so many cases are. This is coming usually in the springtime, and after winter dormancy, they start to green up. Put a lot of fertilizer, irrigations to make a grass, healthy and green. And by May, but if have many nematode presence and cause the issue on the grasses, their primary target is the roots. Okay, so if his roots are a lot of feeding damage from the nematode, then the root is very weak. Okay, so even if you put the fertilizer, water, irrigation, since the root is very stressed, they didn't take enough nutrition as the provided. So the plants start to kind of looking, browning without any clear patch. Okay, so they apply a lot of fertilizer and then also fungicide, and in most of the cases it's not working. And so the finally they send the sample to the clinic and then actually count nematode or identify any potential plant parasitic nematode in there. And there is a lot of nematode was found. Okay, so that's something that we need to aware. If it's a golf course superintendent, we see this is very common disease in around Houston area, and we used to have a very good nematicide. It's called the Nemacure. Has been taken care of past year, but that chemical is off the market because of this is a high toxicity issue. So no more Nemacure, which is promote the human health, okay, but the industry or superintendents lost a good chemical to control, and so this issue, nematode issue, can be is coming back in many of the golf courses. Okay, so how are you going to manage it? So first thing is you need to make sure that you have a nematode issue there, particularly in the Bermuda grass putting green. So send the samples to Kevin and the plant disease diagnostic clinic. Okay, this is a good time for the counting nematode, identify what kind of species there. There is several species, plant parasitic, infecting turf, and their threshold levels of the each different species are varying. So, and the other critical part is this is a small microscopic worm and kind of swimming around this surface of the soil, sand soil. So once the temperatures go up above 100, middle of summer, they're gone because they're too hot for this water-loving animal. And so if you collect a sample in the middle of summer, you might not have a nematode, and so you kind of false sense of security that, oh yeah, I don't have a nematode in my field, but in fact of the matter, this nematode is going back when they cool down in the fall and continuing to damage the grasses. So it's the springtime is the good time for send the sample to ID potential plant parasitic presence in your turf, which is they're not going to be anywhere. They're going to be there perennially. Okay, so if you probably diagnose the presence of this nematode, then you have to plan nematicide preventatively. So this is a perennial. We can't eliminate it, but we can control below the threshold level, cause too much damage. Okay, so mainly the nematicide was targeted to the population but early season, which is early spring, before too hot. Those are good time to knock those nematode population down, and before going through the summer stress period. So there is some alternative nematicide available, not as good as a Nemacure, but there is some chemicals are only like 3 or 4, only handful of the options we have, but we have alternative nematicide and use those chemicals in early season between March to May. So I think that's all I have.
Dr. Zhou, do you see more nematodes lately, or are you seeing more of this, or less, or stable?
We see that the activity of nematode is very active in the surface where those roots are.
Right.
Kind of 2 peaks, 1 peak in the spring and 1 peak in the fall.
Oh.
So that this depending on when you collect the sample, the number of nematode is changing, and so really that nematode application, nematicide application in the middle of summer was not very effective. So spring is the best time, and next alternative may be in the fall.
Just
they don't like the freezing temperature either. So if it's a very cold winter, they are disappear. That means they might die in the surface, but they're kind of moving down to under the ground and kind of stay there, hibernated, and until there's moistures and temperatures, they coming back. So.
Okay. Last week I quizzed you guys. What do you think this is? And of course the if you look closer, that the answer was bagworm. So I just want to tell you that I twisted Erfang's arm like really hard, more than once, twice, and that wasn't hard enough. But your input, I want to give a lot of credit to you guys, to the attendees of this webinar and the previous webinars, and somehow you guys, your comments, that was enough to push Erfang to talk about bagworms. He was saying, there are so many species of bagworms, blah 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 blah. So
the twisted arm and the combination of being pushed over, I couldn't lift myself back up.
And so I just want to give you a heads up that he will be talking about that later. And you'll probably notice that we have a guest speaker, Dr. Carlos Bagworms, because Erfang, I had to twist his arm, so I'm going to put him in the later show today. So Dr. Carlos has something interesting to share with us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. As technical manager with OHP, we still get a lot of questions on possible damage, and in my years in Texas, I hadn't seen this one yet, but this is a damage to a yellow flag iris in a nursery situation, and luckily the person was able to dig into it. And so if you move it to the next slide, the damage is actually caused by maggots of this family of flies. And I was surprised because, this is similar to an onion maggot and the type of damage they cause in onions. But there are some species that have broader range of host plants. And this one apparently went after that iris. Typically, we don't see that as a primary pest. It's not very common. What I think happened was that plant might have been damaged by something else, like cold damage or like drought damage or some physical damage. And then as the bacteria started rotting that dead tissue, this fly was attracted and they took the opportunity. So I don't think it's a primary pest, but it's something to watch for because it's new. And that was it, Mong. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We decided to start a new feature during our chat with your Aggie Greens. It's called Plant of the Week, and our inaugural Plant of the Week is Mystic Spires Blue Salvia by Miss Laura Miller.
So I was kind of inspired by Paul talking about our Texas Superstar program and some Texas superstars. And when Mung said, let's do a plant of the week, I came up with something else. And then I thought it through and thought, you know what, we should really talk about our Texas superstars. They're great plants. So this picture on the left is my front yard. 2 years ago, I decided to take out my chinch bug buffet right there along the street between the sidewalk and the street, and put in some landscape plants. So in this particular salvia was planted in 2018. It's been through 2 winters. It's looking good, and I would say it is about 3 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and you can see it's a lot bigger than that little miniature rose right next to it. So it's quite a nice plant. David Rodriguez in San Antonio, who's worked with the Texas Superstar program, said that these were just too good They were just too good. There were not enough problems with these. And so, you know, we would just put ourselves out of business. As no problems to deal with. And it's certainly been true for me. I really haven't had any problems with it. This is a hybrid salvia. And as you can see, it's got the Farinaceae in it, which is our native salvia like Henry Dulberg. And, you know, it's a pretty good Texas plant. You can obviously put this in a landscape bed. I also have some in containers that have done really well and overwintered last winter. And you can use it for cut flowers. And some of those flower spikes are 14, 16 inches long, which is really pretty cool looking in a floral arrangement. In a container, it makes a great thriller because it just stands up there and does its thing. Full sun. It is hardy all the way up to zone 7. And since 2018, they have improved this plant. This is a slide, a picture from Dr. Brent Pemberton on the right there. You can see that on the left of that picture is the old Mystic Spires, and then on the right is the new Mystic Spires. So you can see them side by side in containers. And you can see that the new Mystic Spires just has better flowers. I think that's really the main improvement. The foliage has always been great on this plant, and it's problem-free. Airfawn's actually doing a lot of cool work on pollinators and trying to get a bunch of people out looking at their plants and figuring out which pollinators come to which plants. And salvias are almost always one of the most popular plant species among, or genus, among all kinds of pollinators, just about everything we track. So they're great for a pollinator garden, great for a lot of different landscaping uses, and obviously deserving of a plant of the week status right now because they look great out in the landscape. So there we go. Not looking so great.
Back to this bagworms. Well, you know, this one definitely looks much better than the bagworms that I just showed you in the previous one. This is a LV bagworm created by Airfawn.
Yeah, since y'all were asking for bagworms so much, this is what you get. This is a bagworm right here. You can go on to the next slide.
Can I just get the bag? I don't want the worm. I just want the bag.
You just want the bag? Don't worry. I don't think that worm could afford a real one. I think it's a fake Louis Vuitton. So here, so bagworms are all in this group, this family Psychidae. And like I'd mentioned earlier, there's a lot of species, and you know, to try and talk about bagworms in like a 5-minute crunch is kind of tight. So I'm just, you know, it's going to be a very surface overview. There's over 1,200 species of bagworms described. And so they're all going to be a little bit different in terms of the types of plant hosts and life history strategies that they may have, and thus perhaps potential management strategies. The larvae develop in this protective bag. All right, so it's not just the final kind of cocoon stage. It is from when you first have those larvae first emerge, they start to develop this bag, and they kind of dwell inside of it. And the females are mostly flightless, almost similar to crepe myrtle bark scale. They kind of create this egg sac, and they stay in there, and they die. They lay all those eggs, and that's about it. And so, and they usually only have one generation per year, so that's known as univoltine. So if you can catch them that one time a year, then you can suppress them pretty good.
Right
and
now.
One of the most
That's right now.
So right around nowish, that's right. Yeah. So if you want to stop them or suppress their populations, now would be the time. I'm not sure what kind of instar they're in. So in terms of insecticide management, so if you're a grower, you really want to hit them when those larvae first come out. Once they're quite a bit older, not only is it harder to actually hit them with a contact insecticide because of that thick bag they have on them, but they're perhaps feeding less, and a larger worm is basically less susceptible because you need a higher dosage to get them. In the landscape, you know, you can pick them off trees, right? So you can just hand pick them off and throw them in a bucket, a container, or whatever, throw it in the freezer if you want to slowly put them to sleep, or do as you please to make them disappear. Now, one of the most common species that we see here when people refer to bagworms is this Theriodopteryx ephemeriformis, okay, which again, it feeds on about 50 different species of evergreen and deciduous. So they're pretty broad spectrum. They feed on a lot of different things. Next slide. And so typically what you get is you have these males. So the males can actually fly. They're usually pretty dark, and they're going to fly around September, October, mate with a female. Usually, again, this depends on species, they'll survive over winter as eggs, and then those eggs will emerge usually around April, June. It might be a little bit earlier, a little bit later, depending on temperature. And that's when you're going to see on that far right, you can see that's actually a larva. You can see that caterpillar that's already kind of inside of a bag, right? So it's already forming a bag. At this point, they're defoliating and chewing on the plant material. They use a combination of that plant material and silk to make these bags around them. When they first come out, they're so small, and they spin that silk as a way of dispersing, right? Because you might be wondering, well, if the females are just dying on that tree and then the larvae can't really fly around, how do they disperse? It's one way is that silk. They use that silk to basically blow around in the wind and disperse that way. Usually, they might cause aesthetic damage, but usually do not cause mortality of a tree. There are some exceptions. So our arborvitae or juniper trees, both of which can be potentially defoliated to the point of mortality. So you want to pick them off or spray them and make sure you protect them pretty good. And you can see there in the left image that, right, it looks like a cocoon or a pupa, but when you open it up, it's full of eggs. So again, that's the female caterpillar. She would have formed kind of like a cocoon. She would lay all of her eggs in there, and she shrivels up and dies. And I can see Becky's face looking at that very unfavorably, showing great concern about perhaps having children. But know that having children as humans, as a human female, is very different, in case you didn't know. All right, we can go on to the next slide. It just has a bit more, just a couple of resources to look up that can be pretty handy. One is from the USDA Forest Service. Has a very good resource in terms of, again, their life cycle and general management. So anything that would work on caterpillars in general is typically what you'd be using against these bagworms, again, at very early instars. Quite a bit later, it's going to be a lot harder to control them. So, whether it be spinosad, BT, and so on and so forth. There's also a great article, if you Google bagworm feature creatures, University of Florida has an excellent fact sheet that's quite detailed if you want to get into the details about bagworms. And that's all I got.
There are several. There are 3 handouts in the handout section. If you guys click on the handout panel on the GoToWebinar thing, so you'll be able to download.
Yeah, you get
those,
the USDA Forest Service one there too.
Yes, those were provided by Airfong. So we got some questions, and I don't want to take this too long. Actually, I have these. I was going to talk about the Creamer bark scale feed-in preference, but I just presented these yesterday, and you'll see the link in our chat with Aggie Green's Facebook page. So just go there, check out the, check out my almost half an hour presentation on, feed-in preference of various plants, beautyberry or crepe myrtles. So let's go to the question section. People love the Texas Superstars, but gosh, they can be desperately hard to find. Any suggestions to help? And I specifically invited Dr. Brent Pemberton to our VIP room. So Brent, do you wanna address that question?
Well, Mung, that is indeed one of the biggest questions we always get, and it's kind of a tough one. It's usually pretty easy to find the most recent Texas Superstars because we obviously try not to promote plants that are not available. But when you start getting into some of the older varieties, it can be very difficult. But one of the things that I try to let people know is to be sure and check out your local garden centers. And this is both independent garden centers and big box stores, because the independent garden centers do have a tendency to carry more unusual plants many times. And especially if you get to know the folks at your local establishment, sometimes they can help you find things. And then another thing about the big box stores is they sometimes will run specific promotions with groups of Texas Superstar plants. And it may not be every Texas Superstar plant that's in there, that's in the brochure or on our website or whatever, but many times you will find them. They're not necessarily always going to be labeled as a Texas Superstar specifically. So it does take some knowledge on your part as far as going to the Texas Superstar website and looking up these plants and know what you're looking for. But those are some pretty good ways to do it. And then also, don't be afraid to go the mail order route. A lot of these are grown from seed, and the seed items are probably a little bit more available than some of the other types of things. So anyway, don't give up. We do try to, you know, if I find out about sources, I try to share that with folks. But anyway, again, it's some of the older ones that sometimes are a little bit more difficult to find. They kind of come in and out of popularity, as all plants do.